Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Ed Batista. I will tell you all about Ed in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with what's too often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment, the courage we exert to make things better. And when you do it as a leader, everything is magnified because you bring people together for common cause. My guest today is Ed Batista. Welcome, Ed.
Hello, John. Thank you very much for having me.
I want to tell everybody about you. You've been an executive coach since 2006, and you work with senior leaders who are facing all kinds of challenges. You work in the tech sector. You're based in California, and you work in biotech, all kinds of stuff. And the folks you work with are managing relationships, key employees, improving the overall climate, tech experts, all this kind of stuff. You also have a significant background at Stanford, where you have taught a course in coaching for 15 years or so, where Stanford was where you got your MBA. And you are also we're an entrepreneur and in management. So you understand what it's like to be in the position where the people that you coach. So welcome, Ed Batista. So.
Thanks, John. I truly am grateful to be here, and have also appreciated your work over the years. One of the reasons why I was excited to join you here is because I've really admired your generosity. You're a real champion of other people's work, including my own, and it was a true honor to be invited to join you.
Well, thank you. I first became acquainted with your work because you were posting 1-minute videos of the Sonoma Valley, and they were so peaceful. I said, who is this guy? Is he a nature photographer or what? And so I kept following you, and then you posted your writings, or I became aware of them. And I said, I've got to know this guy. So I also, and as we said before, and I mean this sincerely, you are a very, very deep thinker. When I read your work, and I encourage everybody to do, so please go to edbatista.com, and I'll put that link in there. Your blog is seminal thinking, and it provokes me to think, and I'm deeply appreciative of that. However, what I find interesting is you come out of management and entrepreneurship. So how did those experiences shape the coaching that you do, Ed?
Sure. Oh, absolutely. In fact, I wouldn't be a coach if it weren't for the career that I had prior to business school and immediately thereafter. I initially got into business school or chose to pursue an MBA because I wanted to help NGOs and the nonprofit sector use technology more effectively. Stanford was a great place to do that. And after business school, I became the first executive director of a group called the Nonprofit Technology Network, N10, whose mission was to help NGOs start to use technology both to deliver services, to raise money, to manage themselves. And I was so passionate about this mission that I found myself getting in all kinds of conflicts with my board of directors. And I had a mentor on my board, a great man named Vince Staley, who was instrumental in my career. And Vince very kindly took me aside and said, "You're a talented young guy, and you have a bunch of rough edges. So I encourage you to go get a coach." Now, my dad, who's 82 and just recently retired as a clinical psychologist, seeing his work over the years got me comfortable with the idea of coaching, but I'd never had a coach before, didn't even really know what it was. I went back to one of my business school profs who I knew had a coaching practice and said, "Would you take me on as a client?" She said, "Sure." And it radically transformed my experience as a leader. I was much more effective at recognizing that it wasn't just my job to come up with all the ideas and champion them, but rather it was my job to build a system that brought people together. So, I wouldn't have become a coach if it weren't for that challenge.
I love that story but it has a twist to it that I haven't heard. Most every senior executive I've ever worked with was successful early in their career, but was pulled aside by a boss who liked them, or maybe a mentor, and said, "If you don't stop what you're doing now, you are going nowhere." And so, but now you have the access to coaching, so that's where we come in. So your experience resonates there. So is that true with you? So, yeah.
Oh, made a huge difference. And I often work with clients who've had some kind of similar experience. They've gotten some feedback, in some cases they're executives in a system and they conducted a 360, or they're founder CEOs and they realize, hey, they're experiencing some unnecessary friction with employees. They're just not accomplishing their goals. And somebody may suggest coaching them. Often, people ask a friend, somebody who understands their professional world and says, hey, I'm really struggling here. What do you think I should do? And hopefully, one of the reasons why I do work with a lot of founder CEOs is in part just because I'm based in the Bay Area, but it's also because that's a field in which there's not a stigma attached to coaching. In fact, kind of the opposite. If you're a founder CEO without a coach, people may wonder why not.
We have a question from a viewer, which I think is very appropriate for you. And he asks, did you know your goals, coaching goals, before you began your coaching? Or how did you come about them, Ed?
No, that's a great question, and I would say it has evolved tremendously. Well, first, the kind of the larger arc of my career is one that it looks neat and tidy in retrospect, but it certainly wasn't all planned out. The work that I did prior to business school and immediately after certainly laid a foundation that allowed me to launch a coaching practice, and then the work that I did subsequently at Stanford enabled me to continue to grow my practice and work independently. But I didn't have that all planned. There was a tremendous amount of accident and happenstance, including the sort of the good graces of people who took an interest in me and supported my growth and development. My own coach, Marianne Huckabee, other colleagues at Stanford who kind of looked out for me, Carol Robin, first among them, and yet my work with clients has changed a lot because I earlier in my career worked with younger folks who were still up on the earlier climb of their career, looking to kind of get that promotion, and that's still the case for some of my clients. But I work increasingly with people who've they've experienced the success that they were aiming at, and that has radically changed my work as a coach, because I'm not trying to help them climb the mountain. They're already at the mountaintop. I'm helping them figure out what's beyond the mountaintop.
Right. That's powerful. So I want to go back to the younger part here, because you have taught at a coaching program, and it's almost legendary. At least I'll say it's legendary at Stanford. What have you learned from students? The program that you taught. What did you learn?
Well, there's a couple of components. One is a piece that I played just a very small part in. Back in 2005 or 6, the business school decided that it wanted to revamp the curriculum and created a team of in-house coaches. And I was privileged enough to be invited to be a member of that team. And then some years later, I got a chance to teach my own course, which I've been teaching since 2015, although I'm winding that part of my career down. But I'm inspired when I think about teaching, especially teaching management. Do you remember the Abilene paradox, that story by a guy named Jerry Harvey? Yeah. So Jerry Harvey has this great essay called Learning to Not Teach. And in it, he says, when students ask me to teach them, I'm confused because I don't know that I have that much to teach. And instead, I believe in what Carl Rogers says, which is Carl Rogers, the great humanist psychologist. Carl Rogers says, not much of value can be taught, but much of value can be learned. And what I've learned by teaching is how little I can teach. I can create an environment in which people learn, especially learn about themselves and learn about how to interact effectively with other people, learn how to think. But that's not me teaching. That's me creating an environment in which people learn.
I think that there's an element of coaching in that as too, because I like to think of coaching as a voyage of self-discovery for the person being coached. And we as coaches are their guides. And we help them. And, sometimes there's, at least in my coaching, some people want specifics. So I will give them that. But that's different. It's got to be an exploration. Would you agree with that, Ed?
Oh, absolutely. And I love that phrase, a voyage of self-discovery. And I'd go further. Earlier in my career, I thought it was a voyage, but I thought it was my boat. And I'm inviting a client or inviting students onto the boat, come with me on my craft. And I'm like, oh, no. They're inviting me onto their boat. I'm joining them on a certain stage of their journey, and then I'm getting off. I'm leaving their boat and they're going on, on their own.
That is great. That is the leadership quotient, I will say, of coaching, because it's not about us. We don't play the game. And I always play game. I shouldn't say this, but I'll say it out loud. When HR people go, well, what are your biggest successes? And I will say, none. I'll go, because I've worked with people who've become CEOs and more successful and all that, but they did the work. I didn't do the work. And so,
you've got to be, you've got to be humble as a coach.
Yeah.
I play a useful role, but I also play a small role. I've calculated it. I work with clients over very long periods of time relative to the field, but I also work with people relatively infrequently. And I have many clients who I talk to once a month. And, so if you run the numbers, I talk to them, less than 1% of their working hours. So that means, Mike, I'm not sitting here by the bat phone where, and that's a mode of working with people that is quite valid. But my aspiration is to help people learn how to coach themselves, which is why the course I wound up launching at Stanford was called The Art of Self-Coaching. I don't want people to feel that they are dependent on their work with me, but rather my work with them helps them become independent, so that during the 99% of their working hours when they're not in touch with me, they feel more capable of coaching themselves throughout that process.
Well, you bring a perspective to coaching, which is shaped by, or your coaching shapes your writing, or vice versa, as it does with me, I guess. And I love some of the recent titles, and we're going to explore some of them. But I just want to say the titles because they're great. They'll go, Not Every End is a Goal, or Midlife Malaise. Power struggles among nice people. So Warrior and the Sage. And this one I want to ask you about: hard problems and soft cultures. So what's that all about, Ed? What's a hard problem in a soft culture? Okay.
Sure. Well, let's start by defining soft cultures. I think there's it's a topic I've been thinking about for some years. I actually wrote that piece relatively recently in wake of the kind of larger change in the macroeconomic climate that we've experienced that has led to a kind of retrenching and a repositioning of profitability over growth as a more important business metric, and which of course has resulted in a lot of layoffs. And it's very important to me. I believe very deeply in the importance of treating people humanely and conducting layoffs in a way that is gracious and offers people dignity. I think doing it in an ungracious, undignified way is unnecessarily cruel, and we shouldn't tolerate it. That said, in the wake of this macro change and the layoffs that ensued, there was a host of public commentary saying, "Oh, this is going to be, this is going to be quite terrible. These organizations are going to become terribly unwelcoming cultures." And in some cases, that may be true, especially when layoffs are conducted in a way that lacks grace or doesn't afford people dignity. That said, what this public commentary, I think, also failed to appreciate is that there are a lot of organizations whose cultures have become too soft. I have clients who have said, look, I'm very, very reluctant to hire people coming from certain organizations because I think that they're kind of fat and lazy organizations that breed complacency. I don't really want to bring that kind of approach to work into my organization, so I'm very hesitant about that. Now, the counterpoint is that a lot of people think, well, we're gonna run our company like a boot camp. It's going to be super high accountability, but empathy is for suckers.
Voices.
Yeah, right. I mean that's absurd. However, we're well schooled in the art of running boot camps. It's a model that makes a lot of sense to us. But the counterpoint is that a lot of these organizations that I was just referring to are kind of like daycares. They're endlessly empathetic, but people are not held accountable. And I think the challenge for leaders today is figuring, and I say this, it's easy to say, it's really hard to do. The challenge is to create a high accountability, high empathy culture in which we treat people like human beings, but people are also held accountable. That to me is the ultimate goal.
Right. I remember this is years ago working with a California company in pharma, a biotech or biogen company, whatever. And they said, was working and they said, the problem around here is everybody's too nice. And I took a step back and I've worked with a lot of manufacturing companies. I go, I'd like a lot of people would train places with you. And they go, no, not. And what it was, and you discovered this, they short themselves, it's their conflict avoidance. And so they suffer from the disease of nice, or I love the way he said, take care.
Mhm, mhm,
so,
mhm.
so,
Well,
so
the disease of nice, that's a great phrase. It reminds me of a thinker who's had a huge influence on my work, and that's Amy Edmondson at Harvard
mm,
Business School. Her work on psychological safety is both essential, I think critically important, and it's often badly misunderstood. She says explicitly, she was interviewed a couple of years ago and says, psychological safety is not about being nice. Psychological safety is about creating an environment in which people feel free to speak up without reprisal. Now, if you have an environment where people are being nice, and afraid to be candid or direct, that's psychologically unsafe.
yeah.
So, niceness can often become a constraint that prevents us from having high accountability cultures. So let's not substitute niceness for empathy. I think they're different things.
This might be related, so I want to throw this out. You have a phrase, and it just popped out at me. What do you mean by the tyranny of feelings?
Oh yeah, I'm glad that resonates with you. That's actually a piece that incorporates a lot of work and much that I've learned from other thinkers. I'm really integrating a lot of work by people who have taught me much. First, it incorporates recognizing what emotions are. Emotions are. I mean, we have this idea in popular culture that sort of emotions are antagonistic to logical reasoning, and that like hot feelings and cool reason sort of battle it out. That's, neuroscientists have understood for decades that's not the way the mind works. Emotions are essential and valuable inputs into the process of logical reasoning. We are unable to actually parse all the data that we need to kind of get through the day if we were to rely just on logical reasoning. It's a slow process.
Yeah.
Whereas emotions are very quick. But neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux's got this great line: emotions are a quick and dirty signal. And our task is to figure out, hey, how do we parse the signal from the noise? Because there's always some signal in a feeling. There's always something that's there and useful, but there's also lots of noise. Emotions are very noisy, and the tyranny of feelings is. Look, we've reached a point, I think, especially as we talk about the importance of emotions in the workplace, where we have, I think, overcorrected. For many years, there was this idea that, well, you should leave your feelings at the office door, which is absurd. You can't, you can't ask people to do that. However, the overcorrection is that we're now privileging the subjective emotional experience. And, if I'm having a feeling, that feeling justifies itself. And if you're doing something that I believe is causing that feeling, then you have to stop. Well, that's the tyranny of feelings, and that's the logic of a child. That's not the way. I think that is not an intelligent way to integrate the emotional experience into our professional lives.
We were talking before we came on air, and we talked about the kind of coaching and how it's evolved. And have you found it, perhaps as provoked by the pandemic, a lot more emphasis on the emotional quotient, and perhaps because of the isolation that many had suffered or endured, and now hybrid workplaces and things like that. So in your coaching, are you exploring the whole self more than you might have done 5 years ago? So.
Yes, although the wrinkle I'd add is I think that the pandemic, it wasn't a radical right turn. It exacerbated existing trends. I think we have become more intelligent about the importance of emotions at work. There's a tremendous amount of valuable research on the contagiousness. Speaking of a pandemic, the contagiousness of a leader's emotions. That's one of the reasons why I emphasize emotions in my practice. It's not because I'm promoting some kind of touchy-feely style of management, but look, everybody in the organization, virtually or in person, is looking to the leader to try to understand what is the leader feeling. And if a leader is unable or unwilling to explore their own emotions and to regulate them, to not simply be governed by the feeling that they're having in the moment, and convey those emotions in a way that is effective and regulated and allows them to have the desired impact on people, they're going to be much less effective. So leaders are so much more effective when they're able to kind of harness their emotions and not suppress them. Emotion regulation is radically different than emotion suppression. Emotional suppression is pretending I'm not feeling what I'm feeling and hoping the feeling goes away. So, emotion regulation allows a leader to say, okay, there's some feelings that I'm having that I can convey. And sometimes this is about uplifting people. Sometimes it's about getting people, joyous and excited. It's not just about being able to convey disappointment or frustration.
Well, it raises the topic and the subject that I've written about it. You've written about it. I think everybody talks about it, and it's less of a buzzword today, but authenticity. So I guess the flip, me being facetious at times, I'll go, well, what if you're a jerk? so what role does self-regulation play in authenticity? So
Yeah. First, I think and connecting the what you just mentioned about authenticity with this idea of the tyranny of feelings, being authentic is not just saying whatever comes into your mind at any moment, in the way that you see fit. I mean that may feel good in the moment, but it's unlikely to help you accomplish your goals, especially as a
right.
leader, because your words are going to have an outsized impact. That said, I think there is a real value in exploring the authentic self, but let's also make a distinction between the created self and the discovered self. I had a great mentor at Stanford, a guy named Scott Bristol, and he taught me this. He taught me that we need to make that distinction, because we so often assume that the authentic self is something that exists. We were born with it, and our task is to sort of uncover it, in which case we have very little ability to influence it. Scott said, that's one way of thinking about it. It doesn't have to be the only way of thinking about it. And he proposed an alternative. The authentic self can be something we discover and create. And that allows us to say, let's also make a distinction between authenticity and comfort. If I have to discover and create my authentic self, then I'm going to have to explore some territory that feels new to me and novel and uncomfortable. And if we define discomfort as inauthentic, well, we're blocking our own growth and development in so many ways.
I'm glad you talked about this, because one of my things is I talk about leadership being an act. And I don't mean that it's, you're lying or dissembling, but we all have different patterns of behavior, and some of us can be, as my wife reminds me, I can sometimes be too negative. If I were in a management position, fortunately I'm not, then that could be an issue. So that's where coaching comes in. But I like to say leaders are acting the role that the organization needs them to play. Would you agree with that?
Precisely. Ed? Yeah, absolutely, John. I have a post called "Leadership as a Performing Art," and I think we need to appreciate that a performance doesn't mean phony. A performance means I'm going to adopt the persona that allows me to accomplish my goals in a given moment. This also incorporates the symbolic aspect of leadership. Leadership isn't just making decisions and allocating resources. Leadership is also embodying a persona that the organization requires. We look to, if we expand well beyond sort of contemporary life and modern organizations, and let's think about the role that leaders play in human groups, throughout history. Well, we look to leaders in a very important way. They serve this unique function, and a leader who's unable to fully occupy that persona, that performance, is going to be much less effective.
And I think so often we want, the last percent, the 2008, 2009, there was I came across a study by McKinsey about people were looking for inspiration from their leaders. And that's kind of struck me and historically, yes, I can understand, but from corporate people, and of course they weren't getting it. But do you think a leader's role is to inspire? So,
great question. I think a leader can play an inspirational role. I go back to this idea, though, that in some cases, in many cases, learning is more important than teaching. Sometimes leaders feel like that inspiration is about exhortation. It's like the cheerleader at the pep rally. I'm going to essentially yell at people. Okay, there's certainly. Look, pep rallies are a thing, and we need cheerleaders. So that's. I'm not saying that should never be the case. But I would rather, that people also incorporate into their motivational repertoire the idea that that they can create the conditions in which people unlock their internal motivations. It's not just about creating some external forces that drive people. That's a form of inspiration and motivation, but it's also insufficient. I think it's more important because all of the sort of extrinsic factors that leaders often rely on, including compensation, are finite and limited. If instead, as a leader, you're able to create an environment that taps into people's inner motivations, in which they feel kind of intrinsically inspired by the work that they're being invited to participate in, that's much more extensible.
Great. Gets to something. We're talking about leadership as aspirational, inspirational at times and stuff. And leaders, the best ones are always putting out. They're always out there. But the flip side, and maybe it's a burnout, but I love you use the phrase called the midlife malaise. So,
Sure.
what is it? And is there a cure?
Yeah, well, I do think there is. In my work there, I'm kind of riffing on the idea of a midlife crisis, which was a concept devised by a guy named Elliot Jacques. Fascinating man. He's the guy who coined the concept of organizational culture back in the 50s. He talks about the midlife crisis, and that's not what I'm talking about. Midlife crisis is, hey, that's when you make a bunch of silly decisions and you buy an expensive sports car and you'll probably ruin a bunch of relationships. That's not what I'm talking about. Yeah. What I am talking about with midlife malaise, because as I mentioned earlier, I work with a lot of people they've climbed the mountain. They may still have financial goals, but that's not the primary driver. It's not the primary reason they work anymore. And in many cases, they find themselves a little surprised. Wow, this is less fulfilling than I thought it was. What's going on here? Why am I not experiencing that kind of permanent or at least sustainable satisfaction? And I saw that pattern so often. It occurred to me that there's something going on here. It's not a crisis. People don't feel like their lives are falling apart and they're not making terribly dumb decisions, but they do feel this sense of malaise. And in my work with folks around this, I've come up with a couple of ideas that helps. I think there's that a single set of activities that constitute a cure, but I think we can, at a high level, say, look, if you can kind of recognize the fact that we're mortal creatures and that life is finite, and that's whatever we believe about what transcends this existence, I think we can agree that this existence itself is finite. That lends it a certain degree of meaning. I think in that context, we also need to cultivate a sense of gratitude for what we have. And I think I certainly do. I feel a lot more grateful for what I have, including existence, when I recognize that this existence is finite. And then invite ourselves, rather than using this sense of malaise as a fuel to drive ourselves into something next, try going nowhere. Try just staying put, and with this recognition that life is finite, with a cultivated sense of gratitude, see how that shifts your perspective on where you are right now.
That's great. I love that. So, Ed, we are racing along in the show. I could go on and on and on, but you are a busy person, so I don't want to take too much of your time. But as you know, on the show, I ask every guest a story about grace. Do you have a story you'd like to share with us, Ed? So.
I do, and I love the fact that is a word that runs through your work. It reminds me of your phrase, intended acts of kindness, something that came up in your book last year, Grace Notes, which I found very inspirational. My story, so I have a friend named Sage Cohen. She's a poet, among other things, and she's got this great line, grief can be a path to grace if that is what you choose. And that came to me last year as I was writing a piece that I called The Legitimacy of Loss. Post-pandemic, so many people that I've worked with and people I know in my own life have struggled to kind of recognize that we've all experienced a variety of losses, many of which we've been reluctant to grieve because we know people who've experienced greater losses. Those of us who have the privilege of transitioning our work from in-person to virtual, we think about people who didn't have that option. And those of us who, got COVID, like I have, and had a hard time with it, know people who've had a worse time or passed away. And so in that context, we've been reluctant to grieve our small losses. And I think it's important to grieve them, to recognize the legitimacy of the losses that we've experienced, no matter how small. And I think that is the path to grace, as my friend Sage says.
That is beautiful thought. I believe in the concept of, we shuffle grace away because it's uncomfortable, and we can talk about other things. So people will more readily talk about the sex life than they will about grief. Right. But it's important, especially when there was a loss, and grief is something that, yes, we know it when we lose a loved one, a friend, a colleague, but also I think there was, and I explored this and. The little book Grace Notes was a loss of our workspace, and for some people that was a loss of identity too, and there was grief in that. So, Ed, this has been such a wonderful, and the comments here are very positive. So you hit a home run, my friend. Despite me, you hit a home run. So
Oh,
Ed,
John, thank you so much, John. I'm delighted to have been here.
how can people find you? So
yeah, thanks for asking. So I am at edbatista.com, EDBATISTA. I'm also on Twitter at Ed Batista, although be warned, I mainly post about my dog Buster and life on a farm, not about serious stuff.
Well, I think the real authority in your family is Buster. So I'm disappointed you didn't bring him on.
Buster, unfortunately, he's 90 pounds, so lifting him up to caramel level would have been a challenge.
Ed, it's been such a pleasure. And with that, we will go out.